Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. Today, we're going to be talking about World of Warcraft Classic, because of course the demo has been out, I've been playing quite a lot of it, and, well, it's very different to the current game, and it's also very similar to the game that I first picked up. And really, I think that is essentially why people are interested in it. They know the game that they play right now, they remember how they felt when they played the game when it first came out, so they want to play WoW Classic and play the game that made them feel that way when it first came out. I suppose the big question then is, well, does that game still evoke that feeling right now? And here's the deal, it's pretty much impossible to tell that from the Classic demo, because World of Warcraft Classic was a pretty slow-paced game where the journey was the thing that mattered, so when you only get 2 zones with a small level bracket, it's quite hard to say anything definite there. But what I can say is how I sort of felt while I was playing it. So the first thing, and this is not to be taken overly seriously, but yeah, there is that big pang of nostalgia when I find myself running over the hills of Westfall, which is very close to one of my first memories of the game. So yeah, nostalgically, I suppose that is kind of interesting, but what really matters is what happens when you actually get down to the gameplay, when you're actually making your way around the world and you're doing things. Well, I think the first thing that I want to start off with is probably classes. Yes, I think it's classes, because that's the thing that immediately to me felt very, very different. I suppose everything felt a lot less designed. It kind of felt like the combat that you were doing, it was just a consequence of the abilities that they happened to give you, rather than some sort of, you know, very, very tightly crafted thing, which is, I think, what we have now, where, you know, our combat on live, it is very, very tightly crafted and designed. And I suppose that means that there's not a great amount of room for doing things differently. And if you do break things down into the numbers of, say, raw DPS, sure, on Classic there is an optimal way of doing things as well, but I suppose by virtue of the way the classes work, you do feel like there is a little bit more of a sense of freedom, like you're a little bit less penciled in, and where this mainly expresses itself is in the overall class design, talents, and spec system. So you're not, I mean, sure, you can be Protection Warrior or a Fury Warrior, but that is so much less of a definite thing than it is on live, because on live, if you hit that button to become a Protection Warrior, you are flat out a different type of warrior. You play completely differently, you have completely different strengths and weaknesses. Well, what happens on Classic, and this is something that I think might be surprising to a lot of the people who have not played Classic and, you know, who sort of picked up the game in more recent times, perhaps post-MOP, but, you know, you don't have a spec, right? Whenever you look at your character sheet, it just says level 16 warrior. It doesn't say level 16 Fury Warrior, Protection Warrior, and that's because whenever you hit the key to look at your talents, you're not locked into any tree. You can just, you know, hybrid between any of them, and that means, yes, you could be 33% arms, fury, and protection as a warrior. I don't recommend doing that, by the way. Not really a good decision, but in terms of game feel and how that comes into the rewards, I think it's kind of interesting, because you do feel like you have more of a blank slate of a character that you can do things with. Now, in a way, there is, I don't want to say there's the illusion of choice, because, yeah, the choices do matter. Like, if you make a bad choice with your talents, congratulations, you've made a bad choice. But it does feel like there is more choice and more customization there. When you look down on, say, your action bar, you have loads of abilities from every single spec. I think where I felt this the most, actually, was on the Mage, and I almost want to do a video that's specifically talking about these different classes and kind of comparing them, because as a Mage, well, whenever I wanted to, you know, open up on an enemy and slow them down, okay, I used Frostbolt. And then while they were slowed, I was like, okay, well, Fireball is, you know, it's more mana efficient per damage, so I'm going to use that. And then if I really wanted to just do, I think, decently high DPS, but at the cost of burning my mana, then I would go for Arcane Missiles, because it does a decent amount of damage, but it's not particularly mana efficient. And what I found that I was doing is, sure, I was a mage, and I had access to you know, all the different types of mage abilities. Actually, quite a lot of abilities. That's one thing I noticed. Your bars are really quite full quite early on. And most of that's not rotational stuff. Most of that is flavor stuff, you know, teamwork stuff like Battle Shout. But I thought that was kind of interesting, because it does make it I don't know, it just makes your character seem like you've got a little bit more going on. I suppose that's very noticeable for, say, the Paladins, where, at level 15, you've got, you've got Bop, you've got the other one, you've got your lay on hands. You're definitely quite, quite powerful. But I suppose Paladins are also a great example of odd gameplay, right? Because Retribution Paladin, I think, often got memed on because what you would do is you would activate one of your seals, and then the way that it would work is Judgment would unleash that seal upon the enemy. I actually think from a fantasy perspective, it's a really cool idea. Like as an example, you could open up with your Crusaders one, and then when you judge the enemy, when your Crusaders seal is active, it removes your seal, and then your enemy will find that, I think they take like additional holy damage, and then you're going to swap over to your Seal of Might. And then the way that it works is that the debuff on them from the Crusader seal is refreshed every time you hit them. So there's like this natural sort of rotation that, that comes about. And it's really slow paced in comparison to what we have now. But it's kind of weird. I don't want to say it's like really good quality gameplay in comparison to the second-to-second gameplay that we have right now. I'll say I did find it kind of satisfying, but it's definitely something that I suppose would get a little bit more boring over time. But the core thing here is the openness of the classes was the first thing that, in terms of my progression and my feel of playing the game, that's really what I noticed first. I felt a little bit more free. Now, I don't want to say that I felt exactly free in the context of being a level 15 character who was always going to be level 15. I felt free in the context of knowing that this is where my character is now. I know how my character is going to progress over time, and I have a whole bunch of talents that I can choose decently free form. Now, the satisfaction of those talents is interesting because Blizzard will always say, with the Mists of Pandaria talent system, you make fewer choices, but they matter more. And they absolutely are correct. Like, each one of the talent choices in the modern talent system of the game, that is really impactful. Well, the way that it used to work is, actually, if you've played Legion, you'll kind of know a little bit of this. So remember all the minor traits, stuff that would maybe decrease the cooldown of an ability, decrease its resource cost, do something like that. Well, that is what all of the original talents were, bar a few particularly powerful abilities which would be throughout there. And that essentially meant with the old talent tree that you had both small incremental rewards like the Legion artifact traits, but then you also had pretty big major abilities, sort of like with the Mists of Pandaria ones, just that, of course, the Mists of Pandaria ones really did double down on that a lot more. As an example, say, Holy Shock at the very bottom of a Holy Paladin talent tree, to the point where people, for a long time were trying to make the Shockadin actually be a thing. So I think that within the context of a game that is slower, that is longer, and that is, I don't want to say that's endgame focused, but as a proportion of total game time, I think endgame is less of Classic than it would be for, for Live, where it takes like 10 hours to hit max level. At least, from the point of the previous expansion. But yeah, the talent system and all that just does feel more satisfying within the context of this sort of long-form progression that you're getting in something like Classic. And it's interesting because the developers pretty much do seem to agree with that being a problem. In the Q&A, Ian said that they are not happy with that feeling of progression that's currently on Live. Which, I suppose just a natural consequence of the talents that they've chosen to go with, but he did say at least that they are looking at changing that. So there's just some broad thoughts on the talents and the classes. I think the TLDR of it is that while the second-to-second gameplay maybe is not absolutely thrilling in comparison to what it is on Live, and maybe that's just me being charitable towards Classic, the gameplay is not mega thrilling, but I think the wider context works a little bit better. The feeling of progression, I think, works a little bit better. That's just that it does feel a little bit more motivating, and even if you are making less interesting decisions, I think that you having more ownership of those decisions because of the more freeform and less directed nature of the design makes them a little bit more satisfying. And then I suppose the last thing to talk about is combat, and it's really funny because your APM and downtime, they vary massively. Now, APM is just short for actions per minute. It's something that, being a StarCraft player originally, that's, something I would, it's a part of that language, the language of that game. Well, your APM's a lot lower in Classic, suffice to say. Just even, mechanics are so different. As an example, Heroic Strike. That's not something that you hit and then it just happens. No, you hit Heroic Strike and it affects your next auto attack. Very different feel to what we have right now. Would not work at all on Live, but it is kind of just interesting how it feels. It's lower APM, but it is kind of satisfying that you're you hit that button and you've queued it up for your next auto attack, and then you're kind of thinking about other things that are going on. Maybe if you've pulled 3 nulls, then you're sort of thinking, Do I have any potions left? Else I'm going to die. Because that is another part of this, but I'll get onto that in a second. So less APM is definitely an interesting feeling. It's not nearly as disastrous to the overall gameplay experience as I would have initially thought, and I think that just speaks to the strengths of World of Warcraft being more along the, the longer form progression and the context of your actions, rather than specifically the actions themselves. Now, on the topic of the multiple gnolls, well, it was really more the Defias Pillagers, because those guys are the same annoying arseholes that I remember back in the day. If you take two of them, it's going to be a problem. When you see them casting their fireball, it's going to be a problem. And that's interesting because the feeling of risk was so much stronger on Classic than it would have been on Live. If an enemy's like 2 levels above you or 3, you're kind of thinking, oh dear, this could be an issue. Of course, that's mostly literally impossible because of the level scaling system that's operating now. So that was interesting from the feeling of fear. Then taking on 2 enemies at once, well, if they are 2 kind of weak enemies that are a level below you or the same level as you, yeah, you're going to be fine. But if that's like 2 Defias Pillagers and you don't have a reliable interrupt, you're dead. And I think the power level of the player character being closer to the NPCs that you're fighting, that does do a lot for the feeling of threat. And it does mean that even completing a simple task feels a little bit more rewarding. Whereas if I think about Battle for Azeroth, I found myself by level 100 I found myself falling asleep with the combat essentially. So I kind of realized, oh, I'm a monk, I'll just, go ham. So for most of my leveling in Battle for Azeroth, I was killing 12 mobs at once using Storm, Earth, and Fire, my Crane Kick, and all that stuff. And yeah, I would push that to the point where I would be very close to dying quite a lot of the time, and that's where it became exciting and enjoyable for me. Well, what's interesting about Classic is I did get that similar feeling from trying to defeat 2 Defias Pillagers who could only melee you and have a fireball. Now, I'm not saying we should go very far in either direction with the live game. I think that's an interesting observation, and I would perhaps think that the Timeless Isles is a good example of some of that working, where if you go to the Timeless Isles on a low-geared character, back in Mists of Pandaria, you'd be in a spot of bother if you went to attack the wrong people and their mechanics mattered, which meant that if you could dodge their mechanics, you'd be doing pretty well. I think that was a really good gameplay design in Timeless Isles, and it almost felt similar to me killing those 2 Defias Pillagers, where my consequences going into my actions, even so going into combat, they would have consequences. And that happened in Timeless Isle. I think that risk-reward, that level of danger in Timeless Isle was really good. It's something they've not really done since. And yeah, I guess that they're the 2 things that are kind of, they remind me of each other. Obviously, they're executing that in very different ways, but they're accomplishing a decently similar feeling. So there's some thoughts in combat, also on classes and talents. Let's move on to the world. So the first thing is that the world not being homogenized around just the Cataclysm. Now, this is going a little bit broader than the Classic demo. I think that's potentially a good thing. One thing about the Cataclysm was that it did bring just sort of condense a lot of things into the Cataclysm storyline. I guess I don't want to say it makes the world feel smaller or anything like that, because it is a pretty cool, pretty big event, and it felt great to play through at the time. But there is definitely the feeling, I suppose, of exploring the world is a little bit more, it's more unique, I suppose, when zones themselves are more unique, and it's not just that every zone story it's this zone plus the Cataclysm. Well, it's just those zones on their own. With Classic, though, of course, the storytelling is, it's worse. It is worse. That stuff just is not being done by Classic. It's a very different type of game. It very much does feel like you're an adventurer who's going around doing tasks for locals, but it kind of makes sense within the broader context of it being a slower-paced game with, I think, progression that feels a little bit more meaningful and is not all completely clustered towards the end game. Now, exploring around the world was kind of interesting because it felt a lot bigger. And that's, I suppose, interesting to me because a part of that, it's fog. And you might be thinking, well, fog is just there because they can't render that much stuff. Yeah, you are right when you think that, but, well, think about these zones. So they were designed in a time where Blizzard knew they needed this pretty close distance fog. And that meant the zones were designed with that fog in mind. And that means that the zones feel really big and expansive, whereas if you go to Westfall and you have view distance 10, it feels really small. And that's why even if you are playing Classic and you put all of your settings up to 10, which looks way better than Classic did, they still have kept that fog, because I think that fog is core to the feel of those vanilla zones and making them feel large. That is, of course, paired with how you do move a lot slower because you're walking about the place. So I suppose that was kind of interesting. And I mean, like Westfall, it's got like 30 quests, maybe 25, barely any. So that's fairly different to how things are on live. Well, okay, Westfall's maybe not the best example. Westfall actually doesn't have that much in the way of quests on live either, but I guess each one of those quests took a lot longer to do back on Classic, and, you know, indeed when we play Classic now. Those quests take a long time in comparison to what they do on live, and it does still make it feel like there's more there than there really is. And because you're doing those quests with that combat that I described, with the classes being how I described, it does, I think it does sort of add this added level of meaning to things. And I don't really think that's me being rose-tinted goggles. I think that this is it's obviously, or maybe it's not obvious, but I think it might be a more niche game than, you know, Classic than Live or something like that. But I do think that its strengths kind of do sort of stand in the modern day. I think more in the way that, like, a lot of these lessons could be applied to the current game and it would still work out quite well. I mean, thinking about, say, RuneScape 2007, that game has a surprisingly high skill cap, actually, when you really get into it. And even though it has some very, very simple combat on the face of things, because that game is sandbox in its nature, and because of the broader context and the pace of the actions that you do, it does have this tremendous feeling of meaning and purpose, which is why that game has been performing so well right now. And I think Classic's tapping into a little bit of that. However, and this may really cause some pitchforks, look, okay, there's obviously strengths Classic has, especially the endgame that RuneScape doesn't have, but there is a built-in longevity to RuneScape 2007 because of its more sandbox nature. And yeah, that's something that Classic isn't really going to have, though I suppose Classic, by being a little bit less rote, a little bit less defined, it's just more that Blizzard have thrown a bunch of tools in a box and you make with them what you will, even though, you know, most people are trending towards the same direction in terms of what they do. But yeah, I do think RuneScape has a little bit of inherent strength there because of it being a little bit more sandboxy. But overall, I think that's mainly what I think about Classic. I really enjoyed playing it. It was definitely a blast from the past, that's for sure. But I do think that when you play it again and you play around with those talents and all of that stuff, the slower pace and the increase in the meaning of your actions combined with the, well, I guess, slower combat that perhaps has more risk rewards and a more dangerous world that feels larger, those things still do stand as strengths. And I think it's very important to listen to that and kind of think, okay, right, why are these things strong? Could any of that be applied to the modern game? Because I think we could keep almost all of the strengths of the modern game as well as some of the best strengths of Classic. I think those things could probably come together in a decently successful manner. But yeah, that's my thoughts on Classic. So if you don't have the virtual ticket, I hope this has helped to inform you about what Classic feels like from a player who enjoys both the old style of gameplay and the new style of gameplay. And if you have been playing the Classic demo, please let me know what you think. I'm dying to hear. So that's it for me. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.